Here's my take on an Indian spiced ground beef dish called Keema. It's best described as a spicier and more flavorful sloppy joe. And instead of having it on a bun, you can have it with some pita or on some rice. It's pretty flexible. I'll be cooking it today outside on my griddle and will be using it as a filling for some King's Hawaiian roll sliders. I got these rolls at a pop up at my local zoo of all places, and I really wanted to try them out. If you can't find these, you can also use any other slider buns or in Filipino rolls will work. My mom used to make this a lot growing up because it was really quick to make and was a cost efficient way to feed two growing cookie monsters. I'll also post the exact recipe for this in the description and share the calories and nutritional information at the end of the video. So stick around if you're interested. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is start preparing our spices. If you've had sloppy joes before, you know that the flavor primarily comes from the sugary barbecue sauce that holds everything together. But for this recipe, we'll actually be using ground spices to flavor this dish. Not only can this be healthier because we're cutting out the sugary sauce, but it can also make things a whole lot easier to make. For this recipe, I'll need about 2 tablespoons of ground cumin and coriander, which I will grind in a mortar and pestle. But you can do this in an easier way if you have a spice grinder. If you're really short on time or if you don't want to grind your own spices, you can actually use packaged spice powders. So these are ground beforehand and packaged, and you can just use them right out of the box. There's one thing to note though that for these pre-ground spices, they'll have a slightly duller flavor because some of the flavor may have been dissipated over time through packaging. But you're trading a whole lot of convenience for a slightly better product. So if you're running short on time, I highly recommend that you use ground spices. You may find it hard to find packaged ground spices if it's not available for you if it's not available at your local grocery stores. So I've actually posted links to Amazon so you can buy them from there directly because these are dry spices. They work great when you're just buying it through an online retailer. If you are using a mortar and pestle, however, to grind your spices, this should take about 3 to 4 minutes to grind both the cumin and the coriander seeds into a coarse powder. Some of you may be wondering, why am I grinding these spices separately if they go in the same dish? Well, it's because we're going to be putting them in at different times. We'll first start by putting the cumin seeds at the start to roast them and release their flavor. The coriander seeds, however, have a delicate citrusy and slightly floral aroma. If we put them at a high heat, this can break down these volatile compounds and diminish the flavor and fragrance that you want in your dish. So by adding them in later, it allows them to retain their essence and release their flavor into the dish in the final stages, resulting in a better end product. Okay, now that we have the spices out of the way with, let's mince some ginger and garlic. Ginger and garlic is actually used in a lot of Indian cooking and forms the aromatic foundation of most savory Indian recipes. They have a strong pungent aroma that actually adds complexity and depth of flavor to most dishes. And the way that we cook them is actually after we blend them up, we start by sautéing them. This releases their volatile compounds and really infuses their flavor into the dish. One other benefit of using ginger and garlic paste as a base is that it has health benefits and it also keeps vampires away, which I guess is another kind of health benefit. Let's start by peeling a small garlic bulb. This should yield about 8 garlic cloves. Once you have them peeled, put them in your mortar and pestle, and also put a 1 inch piece of ginger. I unfortunately ran out of ginger, but I did have some ginger paste that I'll use instead and mash it together with my garlic cloves. It should take me about 2 minutes to smash all of the cloves together in a coarse paste. But if you have a few chunks, don't sweat it. If you're short on time, you can actually find prepared bottles of ginger and garlic paste at most Asian supermarkets if you have one nearby. Okay, now that you got the spices out of the way with, let's actually get started preparing our vegetables. Let's get started with dicing one large onion. A coarse dice is fine. You don't need to use anything fancy here. If you don't have a white onion, you can substitute it with a red onion or shallots. These will work just as fine. Once we're done chopping up our onion, let's start chopping up one large tomato. Any type of tomato will work, but if you have some fancy heirloom tomatoes, don't use those. Go and buy some regular tomatoes. The whole purpose of tomatoes in this dish is only to moisten it and to give it a bit of tang, and you don't want to waste an expensive heirloom tomato for that. Again, a rough dice for this tomato is fine. You don't need to use anything fancy. Now let's chop up a bunch of cilantro. Cilantro is actually a very popular ingredient in South Asian cooking, and it's also used in a lot of Mexican cooking. It can be used to add citrus flavor as well as a slightly peppery flavor to your dish while cooking, and it can also be sprinkled on at the end as a garnish. So let's chop up the cilantro into thin slivers. Now, the last thing that we're going to cut up are some chilies. The chilies that we're going to use are some red and green Thai chilies. I'm using both for color, but you can just stick to one if you can only stick you can just stick with one if you only have one. While I think this dish is incomplete without chilies, I understand that different people have different spice tolerances. So if you want something less spicy, you want a less spicy version of this dish, you can substitute the Thai chilies for something less spicy like jalapenos, or just skip adding them altogether. Okay, now that we're done preparing our ingredients, let's get started cooking. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn on my griddle. I'm going to be turning on two burners and leaving the middle burner off just as a cooler spot, and I'll turn the burners on to about medium heat. That's what works best for me for my griddle. The first thing that we're going to want to cook is our onions because these will take the longest. So before I put the onions on, I'm actually going to measure about 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil, and spread it on one side of the griddle, and then put my onions in it. When using a griddle, you can get a bit loosey goosey with the amount of oil that you put because you're just pressing it out of a squirt bottle. But I like to measure how much I add because I track it for nutritional purposes. And as we all know, as you get older, it's harder to lose weight. So track however much oil you're adding, and you can help manage your calories. Once the onions are doing their thing, let's get started cooking the ground beef. For this recipe, I'll be using about a pound and a half of lean ground beef. You can use regular ground beef if you want as well. It'll probably turn a bit better because of the extra fat that'll help brown the beef and caramelize it. Once the beef is on the pan, start chopping it until it breaks into very coarse bits. This may take a few minutes, but be diligent and try and get all the clumps out. Otherwise, you'll be left with bites of unseasoned beef because the seasoning will not be able to penetrate clumps of beef. Okay, so while the beef and onions cook, I just want to quickly talk about the history of this recipe. So the actual origins of this aren't clear, but it's thought that they have originated from Mughal cuisine, which is actually brought to India during the reign of the Mughal Empire. And the Mughals were actually descended from Mongols and ruled over northern India from the 16th around the mid 18th century. Over the year, the original Mughal recipes have been blended with local taste, and we have what we have today. Okay, now let's get back to cooking. Once the onions start to get translucent, let's add the ground cumin and let it cook and toast together with the onions. Once the beef has started to brown, let's mix it together with the sauteed onions. This step is important because the onions actually act as a sponge, absorbing all of the flavor of the beef and the spices. Once they cook together for a few minutes, let's add in the tomatoes. And now is actually time to steam the beef. So what we're going to do is sprinkle some water and compact the beef and cover it with a griddle steam cover for about 5 minutes to allow it to steam and cook more thoroughly. After about 5 minutes, you can remove the griddle cover and you can continue to work the mixture. The more you mix it, the better the spices and the herbs will spread. Once it's almost cooked, you can add in the ground coriander. You can also add in garam masala, which is a popular spice blend. You can make your own, but I'm going to be using a teaspoon of pre-made garam masala that I bought from Amazon. I'll post a link to this in the description. Now add the cilantro that you've chopped up, as well as your chilies, and continue to mix this. And lastly, just before you finish, you can also add in half a cup of frozen peas. With all of this mixing, it should not be called keema, but actually beef mix a lot. But hey, I'm not the boss. Once the mixture cooks for a few minutes, add in a few slider buns to the griddle to get them to toast. And once they get a light toast, you can take everything off the griddle and it's time to assemble. Okay, so now here comes the really easy part. Because we've added so much flavor to our ground beef, we can keep the toppings really simple. I'm just going to use a bit of mayo for moisture and put them to the bottom of the buns. On top of that, I'll add a cucumber for crunch and greenness. And then I'll put the ground beef mixture on top of the cucumber. And I'll top it off with a small garnish of some cilantro that I had left over, as well as some small slices of chilies for the gram. And there you have it, beef keema sliders. Okay, so here's the nutritional information. This recipe yields 6 servings. Each serving works out to be about 244 calories each. The total fat content per serving is 14 grams. The total carbohydrate content is 8 grams with 22 grams of protein.